Hello again. So the first video, before we dive into the different cultural dimensions and different ways of cultural interaction, we need to understand what culture is a little bit. And in this segment or in this video, I'm particularly quoting Edgar Schein, who's one of the authorities in writing about organizational culture, but he also wrote quite well about macro culture or national cultures, if I may say so. So first of all, we need to understand that cultures are divided into different levels. So we start with what is known as macro culture, which is basically the culture of a nation or an ethnic or a religious group. And then we have organizational culture, and that is obvious from the name. It's the culture of a particular corporation or an organization. And then we have subcultures and microcultures as well. Our focus in this series of videos is mainly about macro cultures, in particular national cultures, and how things may change from one country to another or one region to another. My main experience is in the Middle East, but as much as possible, I'll be also referring to different regions of the world, such as Eastern Asia or Latin America, when that is possible. So from there, we have to understand one thing that is very important. Culture is not a static idea, it's not a static concept. Culture is constantly reenacted and created. And the way culture gets created is by how we interact together. So interactions at some point lead us as a group or individuals, a group of individuals that belong to a certain society or country to observe some solutions and some adaptation methods by which we can resolve our problems. And then we'll see in this series of videos how those practices evolve to become principles and assumptions that eventually shape a culture. The definition of a culture, as written by Edgar Schein, so he goes that the culture of a group can now be defined as a pattern of shared basic assumptions, and assumptions here is very important, and I'm going to explain what that means shortly, learned by a group, and the group here could be citizens of one country, an ethnic group, or a religious group, as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration. So it could be problems that are influenced by some sort of external factors that are new or even not new to that particular group, or it is the way they interact together, to integrate together. So they need to reach some common consensus of what's accepted within this particular group in order to live in harmony. The next bit, which is very important, those sort of practices must work well enough to be considered valid. So anything could start as a practice and then has to prove that it's effective or fruitful or successful for a while before it would be considered valid as a cultural norm. And then what follows accordingly is that this sort of practice that becomes a value and then an assumption, and we'll see that in the next slide, is accordingly taught to new members. So new members could be newborns or, let's say, immigrants who left their countries and they moved to a different country, and then when they need to be integrated, they need to learn about the culture of their new home or their host country, which basically can be translated into those assumptions and beliefs or values, as we're going to see now in this next slide. So again, there are three levels to any given culture. One level is called artifacts. The second level is the espoused beliefs and values, and the third level is the basic underlying assumption. So artifacts basically are the surface level. That includes all visible manifestations of an underlying principle and assumption, the two sub-levels or levels that lay beneath that. So manifestations, they are basically visible or tangible products, such as the architecture, or the language or the communication methods used in a particular culture. And it's very important to note here that any of those artifacts reflect an underlying practice, belief, or value. For example, if you go to Muslim countries, the architecture is mainly about minarets and crescents. The reason for that is minarets were needed a long time ago before the invention of microphones. The call to the prayer had to be called by someone who's standing on high enough ground for everyone in the town to hear it. Crescents are used because the Muslims follow a lunar calendar. So you can see the assumptions or the values from which those artifacts derive. Communication styles are also something of that. An important thing to notice here is that you do not take two artifacts that may look similar coming from two different cultures and assume that they reflect or manifest the same underlying principle, belief, or assumption. A good example are the Egyptian pyramids and the Mayan pyramids. Now, they are both pyramids, they are both quite big and massive. However, the Egyptian pyramids are mainly tombs, so burial grounds for dead royalty, while the Mayan pyramids are actually temples, so places of worship. So they might look the same, but they actually manifest two very different, even contradicting underlying assumptions. So the next level is the beliefs and principles. So just to explain, so beliefs and values actually. So just to explain this a little bit more. So a group's learning basically happens through someone's original belief. So usually there is a leader of some sort. The leader could be a political leader, a religious leader, or a business leader, if we're talking about a particular corporation or organization. That would come in with an idea that is being introduced for the first time. And then, by virtue of being a leader, this person is able to force or enforce somehow the implementation of this idea, despite possible reluctance or resistance from the subordinates. Now, once this idea proves successful, and as we have mentioned earlier, it has to prove successful more than once for a significantly long period, what happens then is that the group tend to believe that this principle or value is what really works. So this, what was once an idea, becomes a fixed value. And then we go to the next level after that, which is assumptions. So once a value has been there for even longer, it is transformed into an assumption. And why is that? Because an assumption basically is that you always assume that this kind of practice is going to work without thinking about it much. So there's always the thing that you're assuming that at times of trouble, this is what historically has been practiced, or the action taken to resolve a problem or to get out of trouble. So because it's been working and proved efficient for 50, 100 or more years, then it's no longer a principle, it's rather an assumption. You just do it without thinking much. You assume, you take it for granted, if I may say so. Now here there's something very important to notice, that often assumptions are no longer realistic or are no longer related to realities. However, they are still being practiced. And here is when we talk about social validation. So very, very ancient assumptions. And again, one thing is important to highlight: when a principle or a value or a belief becomes an assumption, it becomes even harder to challenge. So once this assumption is there, even if it's no longer related to realities, it's still being there because of what's known as social validation. Social validation is basically that when the members of a society still insist that this is what should be done when a certain problem is encountered, and they are often oblivious to whether or not this really works. But because it's being validated by the society, it's very difficult for one person or one member of a particular society or cultural group to defy that. So often, many people tend to go with a particular assumption because of this social validation. And this is obvious in that very last quote that I'm going to leave you with, again from Edgar Schein, which shows why certain individuals may shy away from challenging a particular cultural assumption just because of fear of being excommunicated from their society or their cultural group. We'll end this video for now, and then in our next videos we're going to be talking about the different cultural dimensions and how that defines the different ways of which members of different cultures interact together.